Now we were all ready for our trip to town to get the school teacher and our supplies. We debated which one should go. I decided on Daddy, as he was a well-educated man and better qualified to choose a school teacher than I. In our ignorance, we acted as though teachers grew on trees and all we had to do was pick one, never realizing that in January, teachers were already employed and we would be very fortunate to even find one. Then the gods of the weather took over. The wind blew in hurricane force for 3 days. Finally, the storm broke. It snowed and blowed, and the snow drifted for 3 or 4 days, the worst storm and the coldest winter I'd ever seen in Nevada. When the skies cleared, we found ourselves surrounded with 3 feet of snow. There was no handy airlift to drop food to us or our stock. There we were, snowed in, thermometer stood at 30 below. Whether we survived or not was up to us. If I ever gain any fame in this world, it'll be for proving survival of the fittest. We lived where we should have starved. Fortunately, we had made arrangements with our neighboring sheepmen to pasture our surplus stock of 2 cows and 3 calves. We'd only 1 milk cow and the horses to feed at home. Our hay crop from our 8 acres of meadow had been stacked for us in the PF haystack. The foreman had intended to haul it up to us later as we needed it, but our hay was now a mile away and 3 feet of snow on the ground, which made it difficult to get at. Besides, Daddy had had words with the PF foreman, and he now claimed we had no hay. Our problem was to get that hay to the horse and the cow to keep them alive. It is truly said necessity is the mother of invention. I got no patent for my invention, but I did find a way to get our hay hauled. We had bought a half a ton of wheat for the chickens in the fall, storing it in a tin-lined bin. I took the grain sacks, which had held the wheat, ripped them open, and sewed them together into one big bag, 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. This bag, when crammed full and tight with hay, would hold 100 pounds. We put the pack saddle on Johnny and then placed a big sack over the pack saddle for a blanket. Then Edson and I climbed on and rode very slowly through the 3 feet of snow down to the haystack a mile away. We made these trips at night so the foreman wouldn't see us. The hay was ours, of course, but we had to steal it to get it. We'd fill our bag, cramming it down tight, then tie it securely to the saddle with ropes. Then we'd lead old Johnny to a low, hanging branch of a nearby tree, which stood right at the end of the hay corral. Edson would hold the horse while I climbed the tree, crawling out on the branch that was barely high enough to miss the hay. I would get down on the sack of hay and pick up the reins to hold Johnny steady, while Edson would crawl down on the sack behind me. It was a wobbly, precarious position. Sometimes one of us would fall off, only to rise and flounder through the deep snow, fall again, and finally, grabbing Johnny's tail, we would manage to make it to the corral at home. It was impossible to get back on, once we got away from that friendly tree, though. By making our hay trips every other night, we were able to keep our animals alive through the long, cold winter. As I sat there, swinging and swaying on the hay sack, 3 feet above the back of our tall, bony old horse, I was reminded of my childhood ambition to ride an elephant. The big circuses all came to our home in Ottumwa, Iowa. Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, the Forepaw Brothers, in fact, all of them used to hit our town. How we children used to devour with our eyes those gay posters that were plastered all over the country barns. On circus day, we got up before sunup. Father would hitch the team to our big lumber wagon, pile us all in, and away we would go to the circus. In those days, there was always a parade of the animals through the streets, some in closed cages, but many of them parading loose. The parade was always advertised to start promptly at 10 a.m., but it never came till 1 p.m. The streets would be lined on both sides with people, big, little, young, and old, all leaning out into the street, craning their necks for the first sign of the parade. The big, blue-garbed policemen on their prancing steeds rode back and forth, waving their sticks and pushing the crowds back to the sidewalk. This seemed a useless effort, for as soon as the policeman passed, the crowd would surge again out into the street. Finally, after what seemed to be an endless time, someone would yell, "Here she comes!" and that yell would echo all down the street. The old calliope was first into view, drawn by 6 beautiful prancing white horses, their necks arched, their harnesses and bridles adorned with great red tassels. We children thought the calliope made the sweetest music in the world, But how we loved the huge elephants. I would gaze in awe at the beautiful lady in the grand flowing robe, sitting way up there in the little box atop the animal, swinging and swaying to the rhythm of the elephant's clumsy strides. He was always garbed in bright gold-trimmed purple robe. How I envied the lady way up there in her box saddle. Some day I promised myself I would do the same. I would join a circus when I grew up and learn to ride an elephant. Now in our haylift trips, I was surely getting all the rhythm of the swing and sway, minus the elephant in his magnificent robes and the beautiful flowing gown. But it was all great fun. We laughed a lot and fell off often. Our horse and cow were plentifully supplied with feed, but as time went on, we began to wonder how we were going to make out if we had enough staples to hold out until we could get to town. All our boughten supplies had gone when the storm started. I had had a list a yard long written out for Daddy to buy when he went to town to get the teacher. Now the first one thing, then the other had vanished. First, our sugar. "No sugar?" asked Daddy. He made a terrible fuss not having sugar for his coffee. Now, that want was soon eliminated, for soon we had no coffee to put sugar in. Then the salt went, which I missed more than anything. We had to do without. Next, the lard was gone, and we had no fat of any kind. Our neighbor homesteaders, Tom Spears and John Green, had 2 good, strong saddle horses. When the storm first ended, they decided to ride to town. They stopped at our place and gave us what scant supplies they had. The plan was this. One of them would stay in town and give up his horse to use as a pack animal. The other was to buy a big bill of grub and bring it to us. We gave him one of our precious $20 gold pieces. Although we were snowed in, we anticipated no discomfort for ourselves, for Tom or John would be back in a few days with our provisions. Since we had fruit, vegetables, and meat, we could get along for a while without any boughten supplies. Vegetables without seasoning are not good, so we quit cooking them, for they are better raw without salt. We had lots of flour, for we had laid in a ton early in the fall. It was in sacks wired to the rafters around the house to keep it away from mice. I baked light bread and was very careful to keep my jar of potato yeast fresh, as we had no salt, grease, or baking powder to bake any other sort of bread. I believe the human body needs quantities of fat, for we all longed for fat of some sort. We had plenty of deer meat, but there was no fat on it. I had 24 old hens that I was keeping for next year's stock. I began to kill 1 a week, and by gleaning every bit of gut fat, could get a cupful of fat from each chicken. I made gravy, thickened with a spoonful of flour, and spread the hot gravy over a thick slice of bread. When we had this gravy, it was the only time we would sit at the table to eat. The other times, we would open the top of the stove to grill our slice of venison, lay it hot and dripping between 2 slices of bread, and stand there by the stove with a venison sandwich in one hand, a raw carrot or turnip or chunk of cabbage in the other, and top it off with a dish of canned peaches, pears, or plums. It was our bill of fare for breakfast, dinner, and supper for the next 10 weeks. About a week after the boys went to town, we began to wonder what had become of them and the supplies that we had given them money to buy. Then one night about 10 o'clock, we heard John coming through the meadow, shouting, shooting, and hollering. We thought he must be either drunk or crazy. He proved to be both. Tom had given John the money to buy our food, and John had spent it in the saloon, where he lay drunk several days. The saloon keeper owned a pet monkey, which had bitten 2 of John's fingers, causing infection to set in. When he finally sobered up enough to think of our plight and the bill of grub that he was to buy for us, he bought what he had money enough to buy. He saddled up his horse and came out with our provisions. Excuse me. He had reached our place. He was delirious with pain and fever and had a bad case of blood poisoning. The provisions he had bought us consisted of 50 cents worth of coffee and a flask of whiskey. We were terribly disappointed, but we had no time to think of it, for a man's life was in danger. We had to work fast if we were to save him. I had a 10-pound sack of Epsom salts that the cowboys had supplied me with to doctor one of their sick horses. We put a wash boiler full of water on the stove, emptying in all the salts that would dissolve. We got old John to bed on the couch in the kitchen, but had a hard time holding him there in his delirium. After stripping off his outer clothing, we had to cut his undershirt at the sleeves to get him out of it. His arm was swollen and discolored and almost and discolored almost to the shoulder. There were ugly red streaks running up from the wrist. When the water was hot, we set the boiler on the floor beside him and immersed his arm in it. We had an extra pan of hot salts water on the stove to reinforce the water in the boiler as it cooled. At last John quieted down and went to sleep, but Daddy and I worked steadily on him until daylight. By then the discoloration and angry streaks had all left his arm. When he woke the next day at 4 p.m., he was penitent and much embarrassed. He was a fine old fellow when sober. He saddled up and left as soon as possible, much to our great relief, for one more horse to feed from our precious hay quarters, and one more human being in our close quarters would really have been the last straw. We knew now there was no relief for us, so we had to strengthen our determination and pull through the best way we could. We had an abundance of our home supplies, but we wondered how long we could live on that kind of diet. After about 6 weeks of fare, we began to break out in some kind of rash. We were terribly worried. AJ and I would lie awake at nights wondering if it could be some lack in our diet that was causing us to break out. We weren't sick or feverishly itchy and uncomfortable. What could it be? Could we be getting scurvy? We had read of men at sea getting scurvy from improper diet. Perhaps that's what we had. We looked the word up in the dictionary without getting much enlightenment on the matter. It said covered or affected with scurf or scabby. We weren't scabby, only itchy. We'd scratched the hide off in numerous places, though. Maybe it was the itch. Round and round we went, fearing something, we knew not what. When the storm first ended, we cleared the snow from a place about 12 feet square on the south side of the house, with the building sheltering this cleared place in the north and the snow banked high on the other 3 sides. The clearing made a comfortable place to sit or play, especially from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. when the sun was shining directly down into it. We bundled up and spent all 3 hours out in the sunshine every day. One day, while AJ and the children were out in the sun, I was in the house washing, bending over an old-fashioned tub and board and the steaming hot subs. Suddenly, I felt something crawling across my chest. I opened the front of my dress and my woolen undershirt. Yes, we all wore woolen underthings and needed them badly. And sure enough, there was some small gray insect of some kind crawling across my chest. I picked it up between my thumb and finger and went out where AJ and the children were. "Look, Daddy, what is this? I picked it off my chest." He looked. "Hell, old lady, it's a grayback." "Well, what's a grayback?" I'd never heard of one. "Why, it's a louse. Old lady, you're lousy." Well, then, I decided, that's what's the matter with all of us. "No, sir," Daddy said. "I've been lousy lots of times in mining camp. That's not what ails me." We were all broken out on the wrists. Daddy rolled back his shirt sleeve, turning back the cuff of his undershirt, and sure enough, he was alive with lice. The great mystery had been solved. We were all lousy, even the 2-year-old baby. How any decent, clean family could become so lousy without knowing it was a mystery to me. Old John had left his calling card. Before coming out, he had lain on the floor of the saloon and had picked up the lice. The night he stayed at our house, he had left a few of the seed on the bed. What a relief it was to us to learn that we were only lousy after fearing such terrible things as scurvy and itch, and we knew not what. But it was awful to endure the crawling and itching for the next 24 hours till our clean clothes got dry. We had to wash them. We had to dry them over the stove, and kept a roaring fire going day and night so as to dry them as soon as possible. Then we all took baths with plenty of sheep dip in the water. I had no disinfectant to put in the wash water, so I boiled all our clothing in sheep dip and kerosene. It didn't take long to get deloused once we found out our trouble. Life had to go on in the same monotonous way till snow melted, but our courage and our morale were good. Not one of us was sick a day in all that long, cold winter. Perhaps most of our human aches and pains were caused by overindulgence. We were never comfortably warm and never overstuffed, for the food without seasoning of any kind didn't taste good enough to cause us to overeat. The snow began to disappear slowly, and on the 17th of March, we had been snowed in just 10 weeks. AJ hitched up the wagon and went to town to get our long-delayed provisions and the new school teacher.